I think Australia would be open to that. The Constitution is designed to admit New Zealand to the Federation.
So that's legally,
Yes.
that's available.
Yes.
In terms of the population generally.
I would be surprised if the Australian population resisted New Zealand joining. I really would be.
Well, kia ora, Nick. Welcome to the Maxim podcast. Great to have you with us. Now, just to run through for those of you out there who don't know who we're talking to, you are Professor Nicholas Aroney. I'll use the fulsome version. Professor of Constitutional Law at the University of Queensland and an external fellow of the Centre for Law and Religion at Emory University. You've had books published by Cambridge University, Oxford University. Your areas of interest include comparative federalism, bicameralism, legal pluralism, and law and religion. And you're also an Australian, which brings us to the topic, which is Australia and New Zealand, the ANZAC brotherhood, if you like. Only you guys are the big brothers and we're the small brothers, and you're richer, you're bigger, you're more powerful, and you're more popular given our immigration. So we're gonna just tease out, what do you think is going to go on in that brotherhood, in that relationship going forward? Are we going to converge? Are we going to diverge, or just continue to run parallel? What do you think? What does the future hold?
I reckon, Tim, the first thing to think about is where you're coming from to work out where you're going. So I analyse it by reflecting on the decision the New Zealanders made not to join the Australian Federation so many years ago. In fact, 120 years ago.
You guys still aren't over it, right?
Still upset that you didn't join us,
yeah.
But also recognising that if you had joined us, the Springboks would never have a chance to win the World Cup. But seriously, though...
Actually, now
yes.
We're regretting not joining.
Possibly. Yeah. But that decision was a very fateful decision. And it underscores a very important point, I think, and that is that while it makes sense in some ways to compare Australia and New Zealand, the comparison should also be about New Zealand and the particular states of Australia.
Right. Because we would have been a state.
Yes,
so, yeah.
That's right. And further, in the 1890s, when the Australians and the New Zealanders and the Fijians even were considering whether to federate, they were all just colonies of the United Kingdom. And they were self-governing colonies. And their concerns and interests were to that extent the same. They were weighing up the value of remaining independent of each other, but under Britain, against federating and the benefits that federating would bring. And it's not like they were so different that they thought about that question in a totally different way.
Right. So even, and to be honest, I didn't know about Fiji. Didn't geography play a part in this? You would think naturally you're all in the same landmass.
Yeah.
There's clearly a more obvious sense of shared interests here. That's fascinating about Fiji.
Yeah, it is. And further to that, though, and that is that while Australia might be one continent, it's a really big one. And Perth is as far away from Sydney as Auckland or Wellington or Christchurch, Dunedin, are from Sydney.
Yeah.
So...
And possibly culturally as well.
As well. And look, Tasmania is an island as well.
Yeah.
Don't forget. And
that's true.
Not an easy passage from Victoria to Tasmania either. So I think that New Zealand needs to, in some senses, be compared to each Australian state in order to make sure that you're comparing apples with apples.
Right. Okay, now I'm going to put you on the spot. So which state would you compare us to?
It depends what question you're asking.
Nice tap dance.
Well, because there are many different ways in which you can compare.
Okay.
So I would say by if we were focusing on a political system, the way the political system runs, I would say that New Zealand is most comparable to Queensland. Why? Because Queensland is the only Australian state that only has one House of Parliament, like New Zealand.
We do, yeah.
That's right. And having only one House of Parliament shapes the dynamics of the politics. Because when you're the Prime Minister or the Premier in Queensland and you hold that office because you have support in that one house, you effectively control the parliament as well as the executive. And so the executive power of government and
Much
the power
stronger.
to make laws is in the same hands.
Is the lawmaking in Queensland more extreme because of that?
Certainly it occurs more quickly with less scrutiny.
Is it far? I mean, it has been observed in New Zealand that we have the fastest laws in the West. Is it as fast as our laws?
Look, I think Palmer was a bit too quick to say that. I think Queensland's got the fastest law in the West. We had the capacity to pass laws overnight too.
See, you've done it again, Big Brother. It's like we now have the second fastest law in the West. Ouch.
It's not a very honourable title.
No, let's move on.
But look, if you compare in other dimensions, Queensland's not so much relevant. Like if you compare even the environment, the natural resources, even the weather, probably Victoria is the most comparable.
Okay.
Because it's one of our smaller states. It's more compacted into a land mass that's not dissimilar to New Zealand's, recognising New Zealand has 2 islands. But on the other hand, and sometimes I think a little bit mischievously, I'd say that it could be most compared to both Victoria and Tasmania.
Right.
Because, and I'm not saying that Tasmania is exactly like the South Island of New Zealand or Victoria's like the North Island.
We just lost everywhere south of Wellington. Thanks a lot.
But all Australians know that the South Island is the place to visit.
Right.
So I'll make that point in favour of the Southerners.
So wait, you're saying we're essentially Vic Mania?
Could be Vic Mania. It's an interesting expression that I personally wouldn't use, except amongst friends. But there is a sense in which maybe New Zealand is a bit like Vic Mania.
Look, I think I'm going to keep moving past that. In New Zealand, we do have we have a notion that government is benign. So and I think I wonder if that affects the arrangements in a place like Queensland, which is like, well, we only need government is basically benign, so we only need one house, etc. Whereas there may be a greater suspicion in other states, which is why you have the bicameral mode, so that the upper houses dilute the speed and perhaps extremity of lower houses.
I think that's true. And further, not all upper houses are the same. So the New South Wales upper house is a very dynamic and powerful house relative to others in some ways. Yeah. And New South Wales being such a large state with such a large population is quite different. And it could be said that perhaps Victoria and Queensland in their own way can be quicker to introduce laws and go down certain pathways than New South Wales. The words progressive and conservative have a certain sort of political connotation, but even just to use those words neutrally around how much a political system changes and how much it doesn't change its fundamental laws, we could say that New South Wales is slower to do that, Victoria faster, and that could mean it's better or worse because it depends on, change in itself is not necessarily good or bad. It just depends on what changes you actually make.
It depends on what the change is and what the change produces as well, what's intended and unintended.
Because I'd say the other Australian state that should be brought into calculations is South Australia. Because where South Australia and Victoria, I keep saying that. New Zealand.
You just want to keep saying Vic Mania.
Sorry about Victoria, but New Zealand is similar to South Australia in this respect, that South Australia was not a convict settlement. And so the South Australians back in the 1890s when we were federated had a sense of, I really don't mean superiority, but they were proud of the fact that they were a free colony and were very progressive politically, probably in that political sense I was using before. I mean, they were amongst the first in the world, like New Zealanders, to give women the vote, for example. And so there was a sense in which they were a little different from the other Australian colonies. And so this is why I say you've got to pick the Australian state you compare New Zealand to, depending on what question you're asking. And it doesn't make as much sense to just simply compare New Zealand to Australia.
Yeah, and I think that is certainly something that often occurs here in New Zealand as we compare ourselves to Australia. But if we were to compare ourselves with Victoria, perhaps we would end up with different answers to the questions we're asking. And indeed, if we compared ourselves to the state of Vic Mania, who knows what we would have come up with.
It could be. Look, it's not altogether out of place to compare New Zealand and Australia in this particular respect.
Yeah.
New Zealand chose not to join the Federation, and that means it maintains its own independent international policies and government. It's a nation state. Victoria or Queensland or whichever Australian state we think of, in federating, gave up that capacity to the Commonwealth of Australia. So New Zealand is different from every Australian state in the sense that it has the power, the capacity to determine its own foreign policies.
Exercise its own foreign policy. You may not know the answer to this. What was the Defence Force standing within New Zealand at the time as compared to defensive arrangements with the states as colonies?
I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. I do know that question was one of the questions at the forefront of everybody's minds at the time of federation.
Because that's the question is, what are we going to benefit from,
That's right.
from this?
And one of the key reasons why countries or independent political communities federate is the benefit of enjoying a joint defence. We're stronger together.
Yeah.
And so that would have been it gave all of the Australasian colonies reason to federate. And the view I've taken after looking at this, some decades ago, is that the New Zealand decision was partly motivated by this idea that, in fact, we have taken steps towards international rights and personality a bit more than the other Australians.
We're more advanced.
A little bit, in that sense.
And this
by
is
entering
because
into, the Treaty of Waitangi is an example. None of the Australian colonies had entered into a treaty with Indigenous peoples. And of course, a treaty like that is of great significance to Maori people, Indigenous people. But even from the point of view of the non-Indigenous people, the very capacity to enter into a treaty as a colony is a remarkable international capacity. And so it seems to me that from the New Zealand point of view, the decision was whether to join a federation under which you would lose control over your foreign policy, that capacity to do that. But then I think the New Zealanders, and they actually said this explicitly, several of the New Zealand leaders, but we can use that capacity to negotiate with the new Australia treaties that will give us the sort of mutual defence understandings and even the trade relationships and even the migration rights that would be something similar to what we'd gained by federating.
And so we don't have to give a whole bunch of stuff away. We can stay as we are and we'll still get the benefits if we do it through negotiation.
Pretty well, yeah. Because at the base of every federation is freedom of movement, freedom of trade and mutual defence. And so if you can negotiate with other countries those benefits, you've got some of the foundations that build into a federation. The big difference is, though, that by federating you form a federal government with powers to make real laws and, as I say, a foreign policy that you lose control of. And that's what you lose by federating, as it were.
Yeah. When I think about some of our foreign policy moves, I wish we'd federated, but let's not go there. Given that we didn't join the Australian Federation, where do you see things at now? Obviously, and you point out the category era in a sense of comparing New Zealand as a country to Australia as a country. There's some benefits there, but it's more reasonable to compare us to another Australian state. The relationship, as you see it, is it going? Are we going to diverge? Are we going to converge, or are we just going to keep running sort of parallel? The little brother running after you, saying, "Please, look at me."
Well, this is why I want to suggest that it's not a simple question to answer, because this question of divergence, convergence, or parallel tracks has to be considered against a whole lot of dimensions. So it's really quite possible in a complex society like New Zealand's or like each of the Australian states or Australia as a whole, that in one dimension or another, we are very similar. So similar, we're almost really pals. And we're because the level of migration.
Come on, I've been using the metaphor of brothers, and you go to pals. You're so cold, Nick.
Because, like, if you to make the point culturally, like we love our rugby rivalry that used to exist when we had a decent national team in Australia.
You were half good at it.
When we were half good at it. But we have the same rivalry between New South Wales and Queensland in rugby league, which is something that I think even some New Zealanders watch from time to time, called the State of Origin. And what does that reflect? Both difference and commonality so strong that the two nations are
There's competition.
One.
Yeah.
So culturally we share so much that I would say it's not even a question of divergent, convergent, but actually in a certain respect oneness. And I do think our two countries have an underlying oneness. I think if you meet a New Zealander overseas in any country as an Australian, and I would like to think vice versa, you feel like
there's
comrades.
an immediate commonality. I've
Absolutely.
felt that on numerous occasions, which you wouldn't ordinarily have if you were down in your own neighbourhood.
Yep.
But when you're in another neighbourhood,
That's
it's
right.
like, I understand you.
That's
and
right.
I think you understand me.
That's right. And I would venture to say stronger than the link you might have with another English person in another country or an American or even a Canadian. There's degrees of commonality there. So I think that's really important. And even if you just look at the demographics and the ethnic makeup of our two countries, there's just profound similarities. Because we were initially British colonies, we did have significant Indigenous populations. And here we are, settler communities with Indigenous populations in the Antipodes. We are the Antipodes. So there's a real commonality there, and there's such a thing as Australasia in that sense. So I think in that sense we're one. Now, how are we different then?
Can I just tease that and just assuming there is suddenly a desire within New Zealand for Australia to bring us in, is there any desire or benefit to Australia to do that?
I think Australia would be open to that. The Constitution is designed to admit New Zealand to the Federation.
So that's legally,
yes,
that's available.
Yes.
In terms of the population generally.
I would be surprised if the Australian population resisted New Zealand joining.
Wow.
I really would be, to be honest.
That surprises me. Because I think I don't know, I think the issue would be within New Zealand, would we join Australia? Oh, that would be like admitting that the last 100 or so years have been an unfortunate experiment.
It's a fascinating question, and I think it's a question that should be asked of the population. Imagine the answers.
That would be, yeah.
I'm not a betting man, but I'd love to wager. I think Australians would be open to the thought.
Huh. Now there's a referendum you could get behind.
I would, because I've read the foundation debates of the Federation. The Australians, the people involved in that debate, including New Zealanders, wanted to create a federation that would be open to new states. And we've not done it. There's a sense in which it has placed a limit on our growth. Like the thing that's like the two other federations to which Australia is very comparable are the United States and Canada. But what's different about both of them, especially the US but also Canada, is that there was this growth of the federation as new states or new provinces were added.
Right.
We, because of the dynamics of the British settlement and the British claim to vast tracts of the entire continent, that we carved up the continent right from the beginning, and not without some injustice to the Indigenous people, I would want to emphasise. But in that context then, there were no more spaces in Australia.
It was static, yeah.
So, and I think that it would be quite consistent with the vision of the framers of the Constitution to see us expand. And look, you might say, well, it's just one more state, but it would be a very substantial state. Like New Zealand has a population, I think, larger than Victoria, and has more resources than that state, and that's a big state in Australia. So in terms of its population, New Zealand would bring a lot to the country. And so my sense is it really would depend more on the New Zealanders, and so it should, because that's the whole point of a federation. You don't force countries into it.
No, there has to be.
It's negotiated and it's freely agreed.
I wonder, I mean, we saw the Prime Minister recently talking about closer defence arrangements such as AUKUS, etc. that the geopolitical environment, which is moving past a rules-based consensus arrangement, it's going to be a lot more fluid over the next few decades. This may be something that at the moment is seen as preposterous, a great talking point, but it may become less so as the world becomes, or at least our neighbourhood becomes less congenial.
Yes. So I think that that's another important dimension, and it is a dimension where we aren't the same. And in fact, to the extent we've been parallel and we've been divergent at times, and we could be becoming convergent. Let me unpack that, though, a little bit more. It seems to me that after the federation of the Australian colonies, so that's in 1901, they were still parts of the British Empire as such, and so was New Zealand. And so despite the fact that New Zealand was a little more independent-minded at that point, when it came to the First World War, Australia and New Zealand were essentially necessarily committed to being part of the British Empire and fighting on its behalf. It was after the First World War that the empire was readjusted, as it were, to recognise a much higher degree of political maturity amongst both the Australian and the New Zealand governments and countries as a whole. Then came the Second World War. That sort of commitment continued for both countries, and we fought side by side, and ANZAC really means something. ANZAC Day is the high point of the Australian, I think, calendar, really, and maybe here as well.
It'll be a competition, I think, between Waitangi Day and
right.
and Anzac Day.
Well, isn't that interesting? I think Anzac Day for Australia is just it.
Yeah.
So we think of you guys more than maybe you think of us. I don't know. But it's a really big thing, Anzac
sorry,
Day.
what was that?
But look, it seems to me that then after the Second World War, both countries are even more established in their independence. And then the critical question is, what do you do with that? And I think experts will know this in more detail than me, but my sense of it is that after the Second World War, the importance of the United States to the defence of the Pacific became very clearly recognised. The British really didn't have the capacity to exert any sort of power or defence capacity in the region. And so the natural evolution was towards what did develop, and that was a treaty between Australia, New Zealand and the United States, the ANZUS Treaty. And it seems to me that that was a moment where there was a strong convergence in military terms in the sense of the understandings and actual hard agreement under that to act in response to acts of aggression against any of the countries. Now, of course, famously, when New Zealand then, exercising its rights to have its own independent foreign policy, took the view in the 1980s.
This is the anti-nuclear.
To have an anti-nuclear policy and preventing American warships that may or may not have nuclear power in them from entering New Zealand ports. And of course, what was then renegotiated, my understanding of it is, and I'm no specialist, is separate treaties between Australia and New Zealand on one hand and Australia and the United States on the other, which sort of patched up the arrangements. Now, there's a clear divergence that occurred during that time from the 80s onwards. And it now seems that there could be something of a convergence back. Yeah.
There's certainly been a thawing in that relationship. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and there's so many more dimensions to these things in terms of other arrangements that exist in terms of sharing intelligence and other sort of multilateral defence arrangements with other countries in the region that are emerging. So, because Australia and New Zealand, of course, are part of a Southeast Asian, Pacific region that has many players, and we are two of the most significant countries in terms of our size, population and resources. So it makes sense. So there could be. It seems to me, though, that that's all going to depend on, as it were, the politics, the perspectives of elected governments in both countries and all those countries.
I think it's interesting that you go back to that federation discussion because you're saying it was premised on number one, defence, and number two, economics. And I think, though, if the arrangements that we have now change, it'll be because of those again. So isn't that fascinating that although we would see ourselves as we live in a different era, the drivers remain the same.
It seems to me, yes, because those drivers are the reflection of history. We can go back millennia and we can see that relations between nations or powers that we might call them are negotiated by treaty. The concept of a treaty is one of the oldest human institutions. And so while you might say, well, New Zealand doesn't have a constitution and Australia has a federation, all of these sorts of things, there's a sense in which there is certain constitutional settings established by the international law and relation between Australia and New Zealand. And it's really within that framework. So you could say, well, New Zealand chose not to federate, but in another sense, they chose not to. In other words, it actually produces a certain order of, a certain international order between the two countries.
Right.
That becomes the foundation of the future.
The desire not to is a kind of harmonic in some sense,
Yes.
because it's under the rule of law.
Yes.
And that could be the basis for a new arrangement. I'm still fascinated by the idea of New Zealand being absorbed into, not absorbed, but having a much closer relationship with Australia.
But because from the Australian point of view, it would be New Zealand having the status of a state.
Yeah.
And in Australia, that's a significant status. Like it's a constitutionally protected capacity to govern yourself. And it's in the context of a federation of limited power. I mean, I'm a bit of an exponent of federalism, so I have a warm attachment to the idea.
Professor Nick Aroney, I love how you're selling it. There we go. It may be that this has not only been a podcast, but a prophecy as well. New Zealand joins Australia. Thank you for your time.
Real pleasure being here. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks for tuning in to the Maxim Institute podcast. If you want to stay updated on our latest research and insights into New Zealand politics and policy, sign up for our monthly forum email and event invites on our website. Be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. From the team at Maxim, mā te wā. Goodbye for now.